The winter of 1864 was the kind that swallowed people whole. Snow fell without mercy across the Dakota Territory, burying the land under a silence so heavy it felt like a coffin lid pressing down from the sky. Clara Morse had been walking for 3 days. Her boots had split open at the seams on the second morning, and now her feet were wrapped in strips torn from her petticoat, soaked, frozen, and nearly black with cold. She did not cry. She had run out of tears somewhere near the Platte River, right around the time she realized she was going to die. She was 23 years old, and she had made nothing but mistakes. It had started with a man named Harlan Brecht, a wagon driver with smooth hands and smoother words. He had told her he was taking a supply run west and offered her passage for the price of a cook. She had believed him. That was her first mistake. Her second was climbing into that wagon with everything she owned: a Bible, a wool blanket, and $47 sewn into the hem of her dress. Her third mistake was sleeping. When she woke up, the wagon was gone, Harlan was gone, and so was every single dollar. She was alone in a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon, and the nearest town was a name she had heard only once and could not remember. For 3 days she walked east, or what she believed was east. The sun was a pale ghost behind thick clouds and offered her no real direction. She ate snow and chewed on frozen bark. On the second night she killed a rabbit with a rock, a moment of savage luck, and ate it raw because she could not get a fire started. The meat made her stomach cramp but kept her alive. By the third day her mind began to do strange things. She heard her mother calling her name from behind a ridge. She saw a lamp burning in a window that was not there. She began to talk to herself, then to God, then to no one in particular. She topped a rise and saw the camp below. It was a Lakota winter camp, maybe 30 lodges arranged in a careful circle, smoke rising from each one into the pale sky. Dogs moved between the structures. Children ran. A group of men stood near the tree line with bows in hand. For a long moment Clara stood on that rise and felt something she had not expected. Not fear, but a deep, hollow relief. She had found people. She had found warmth. She had found something other than the endless white nothing. Then the men saw her. They moved toward her with purpose and speed, and the relief inside her cracked apart like ice underfoot. She raised her hands. Her lips were too cracked to form words. The men surrounded her, their faces unreadable, their eyes sharp and serious. She understood nothing they said. They understood nothing she tried to say. One man, older, broader than the rest, with a calm authority that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a coal, stepped forward and studied her without speaking for a long moment. Clara Morse did something then that she had not planned. She dropped to her knees in the snow, looked up at that man and said the truest thing she had said in months. "I don't want to fight," she whispered. "I just want to not be dead." The man looked at her for another long beat. Then he said something to the men around him. 2 of them stepped forward, took her by the arms, gently she noticed, and walked her into the camp. She did not resist. She had nothing left to resist with. As they led her between the lodges and the curious eyes of women and children followed her path, Clara felt the warmth of the fires reaching out to meet her skin, and for the first time in 3 days she let herself believe she might survive the night. She did not yet know the name of the man who had made that choice. She did not know that his name was Dakota, and that his decision to bring her in rather than turn her away was already the most controversial thing he had done all winter. She did not know that she would soon beg him to end her life, or that he would refuse. Clara woke up warm for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. She lay on a thick buffalo robe inside a lodge that smelled of wood smoke, dried meat, and something faintly herbal she could not name. Light filtered through the smoke hole above her head. For several seconds she simply stared at the ceiling and breathed, cataloging the miracle of sensation, warmth against her back, her feet free of pain for the first time in days, the clean smell of something cooking nearby. Then she remembered where she was and she sat up fast. A woman was watching her from across the fire. She was perhaps 40 years old, with deep brown eyes and a patient expression that suggested she had been sitting there for some time. She did not startle at Clara's sudden movement. She simply reached across and held out a wooden bowl containing a thick, dark broth. Clara stared at it. The woman extended her arm further, an unmistakable gesture. Clara took the bowl and drank. The broth was extraordinary. She did not know what was in it. She did not care. It moved through her body like something sacred, filling up all the cold and hollow places. She finished it in under a minute and then held the empty bowl in her lap and felt tears sliding down her face without fully understanding why. The woman took the bowl back without comment and refilled it. Over the following days, Clara began to understand the shape of her situation. She was alive. She was being fed and sheltered. She was also, unmistakably, a prisoner, or at least a guest whose movements were carefully managed. She was not restrained, but she was watched. Children followed her wherever she went, bold and curious, sometimes reaching out to touch her hair with wondering expressions. The women of the camp were cautious but not unkind. A few of the men looked at her with open suspicion. Others simply ignored her entirely, as though she were a stray dog that had wandered in from the cold and would eventually wander out again. The man who had brought her in, the one with the calm authority, she saw every day. He moved through the camp with the ease of a man who knew exactly who he was. People spoke to him differently than they spoke to each other. He listened more than he talked, and when he did speak, others stopped to hear it. An elder told her his name, gesturing and speaking slowly, Lakota. The word meant something she sensed, though she could not ask what. On the fourth day, Lakota came to the lodge where she was staying and sat across the fire from her. The woman who had been caring for her, his sister, Clara would later learn, sat nearby but did not intervene. For a long time Lakota simply looked at Clara with those steady, measuring eyes. Then he pointed at her, then at the direction of the rising sun, and made a walking motion with his fingers. She thought. He was asking if she had come from the east. She nodded vigorously. He pointed west. Made a different gesture, one that suggested a group of people, a community movement. She shook her head. There was no wagon train. No family waiting. No one coming for her. She tried to convey this with her expression alone, pressing her hands together and then opening them flat and empty. Nothing. No one. Something shifted in his face. Not pity, she did not think this was a man who did pity easily. Something closer to assessment. He was recalculating, she realized. He had perhaps expected her to be a problem with a solution. Return her to her people and the problem disappears. Now he understood that there were no people to return her to. She was a problem with no obvious answer. What she did not know and could not see was what was happening outside that lodge. The camp was divided. Several of the older warriors argued that keeping a white woman was dangerous, that soldiers would come looking, that it would be used as a pretext for violence. A younger faction disagreed, insisting that turning her out in this weather was the same as killing her. Lakota, as chief, held the deciding voice. And he had not yet decided. Clara also did not know, could not have known, that the winter ahead held something far worse than cold. That a sickness was moving through the neighboring camps. That what felt like safety was actually the eye of a storm. She had walked out of one disaster and straight into the beginning of another. But on that fourth day, sitting across the fire from Lakota while his sister poured more broth into her bowl, Clara Morse felt something almost like hope. It was fragile and stupid and probably wrong. She held it anyway. Hope, Clara discovered, is a difficult thing to maintain when everything around you is dying. It began 3 weeks after she arrived. A boy from the camp, no older than 7, with quick eyes and a gap-toothed smile, who had been one of the boldest of the children who followed her around, developed a fever. By the next morning 2 more children were sick. By the end of the week it had spread to the adults. The camp's medicine man worked without rest. Women boiled herbs and chanted and pressed cool cloths to burning foreheads. None of it was enough. It was measles. Clara recognized the rash when she saw it, recognized the symptoms from the outbreak that had swept through her hometown in Ohio when she was 11 years old. Back then, 3 children in her street had died. She remembered her mother speaking in low, tight whispers about how fast it moved, how little anyone could do. She had never imagined she would watch it happen again here in a different world entirely. She tried to help. She moved from lodge to lodge with Lakota's sister, whose name she had learned was Winona, doing everything she could think of, keeping patients cool when fever spiked, keeping them warm when chills set in, making sure they drank, sitting with them through the worst hours of the night. She had no medicine. She had no tools beyond her hands and her presence. She gave both without reservation. But the dying continued. The boy with the gap-toothed smile died on a Thursday morning just after dawn. Clara held his hand at the end. She did not speak because she had no words in his language, but she stayed. She pressed his small hand between both of hers and stayed until it was over. Then she walked out of the lodge and into the cold air and stood in the snow for a long time without moving. 3 more died that week. Then 2 in a single night. The grief in the camp was a physical presence. It moved between the lodges like smoke, it sat on every face, it changed the quality of the air itself. And in the middle of all of it, Clara began to fall apart. It came on slowly and then all at once. She stopped eating. She stopped sleeping properly. She lay on her buffalo robe at night and stared at the lodge ceiling while a voice in the back of her skull told her, with brutal patience, that she was the cause of this. She had walked into this camp. She had come from somewhere, from a world of wagon trains and trading posts and crowds of people, and she had brought something with her. The sickness. The measles. It had been gestating in her body even as they pulled her out of the snow, even as Winona pressed warm broth into her hands. She told herself this was perhaps not rational. The logical part of her mind, small, quiet, increasingly overwhelmed, tried to argue back. But the grief was louder than logic. The dead boy's face was louder than anything. She found Dakota on a gray afternoon when the wind had dropped and the camp lay quiet and exhausted. He was standing at the edge of the tree line, looking out at nothing in particular. She walked up to him and stood beside him for a moment. Then she turned to face him, and in the clearest, most deliberate gesture she could manage, she made her request. She pointed at herself, pressed her hand to her heart, then drew a slow, unmistakable line across her own throat. She watched his face. She saw him understand. "Kill me," she was saying. "This is my fault." And it. Dakota looked at her for a long time. His expression did not change in the way she expected. There was no anger, no disgust, no quick refusal. He simply looked at her with those deep, still eyes, and in that look she felt, strangely, painfully, that he was seeing her more clearly than she could see herself. He was looking at all of her. The guilt and the grief and the exhaustion and the thing underneath all of that which was not really a wish to die but a desperate, screaming need for the pain to stop. He said one word. She did not know the word. But the shake of his head was universal. No. Then he turned and walked back into the camp, and she stood alone at the tree line in the gray afternoon, and she did not know whether to feel saved or abandoned. Dakota did not sleep that night. He sat by the fire in his own lodge long after the camp had gone quiet, staring into the coals with the particular stillness of a man carrying something that has no name yet. He had watched Clara Morse fall apart over the past weeks with the eyes of someone who understood grief in all its shapes. He had lost a son 3 winters ago, fever, quick and total, nothing to be done. He had stood in the snow afterward and felt the same bottomless emptiness that he now saw written across the strange white woman's face. He did not blame her for the sickness. He had thought carefully about this. Sickness moved through the world according to its own logic, its own hunger. It had visited his people before she arrived. It would visit after she was gone. He had watched his medicine man and the older women discuss the origin of this particular wave of illness, and the conclusion pointed not to Clara but to a trading post visit 2 of his warriors had made a full month before she stumbled into their camp. She was not the source. She was simply there, suffering alongside them, and her mind had done what grieving minds do when they are broken enough. It had reached for the most available explanation and made it gospel. He understood this. He did not hold it against her. What he held instead was a decision. In the morning, Dakota called together the camp's council, 7 men whose judgment he trusted, whose experience covered between them nearly 3 centuries of living. He told them what Clara had done, what she had asked. He told them what he had observed of her in the weeks she had been with them, how she had worked alongside Winona without being asked, how she had sat with the dying without flinching, how she had pushed through her own exhaustion to be useful. He told them he believed her mind was broken by grief, not by wickedness, and that what she needed was not death but direction. The council debated for 2 hours. 3 men argued that the situation had grown too complicated, that she should be escorted to the nearest trading post and released. 2 argued that she was now a part of the camp story, whether anyone liked it or not, and that abandoning her in her current state of mind was no different from leaving her in the snow. 1 man said nothing for the entire discussion, which Dakota had learned over many years was always the most meaningful contribution. At the end of the 2 hours, Dakota spoke. He said he would take personal responsibility for Clara Morse. He would work to restore her to herself, not through pity but through purpose. A person without purpose, he told the council, is a person who cannot survive. It was the same whether you were born Lakota or born somewhere else entirely. Purpose was the thing. It was always the thing. The council accepted this. That afternoon, Dakota went to find Clara. He found her exactly where Winona had told him she would be, sitting outside the lodge on a log, staring at the snow. She looked up when he approached. There was something in her eyes that was worse than sadness. It was the absence of expectation. She had stopped hoping he would change his mind about her request, which meant she had stopped hoping about much of anything. He sat down beside her on the log. This surprised her. She shifted slightly as if uncertain whether to move away. He stayed where he was. He had spent the morning with one of his warriors who had learned a handful of English words from years of trading. Through careful relay and repeated gestures, Dakota had assembled a small collection of phrases he could attempt to say himself. They were imperfect. They were approximate. But language, he had learned, was less about the exact words and more about the honest intention behind them. He looked at Clara and said, slowly and deliberately, in broken but unmistakable English, "You stay. You help. You matter." She stared at him. He said it again, steadier this time. "You stay. You help. You matter." Clara Morse pressed both hands over her mouth and made a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh and was somehow both of those things at once. Her shoulders shook. Her eyes filled. She was not pretty when she cried. Her face went blotchy and her breath came in uneven gasps. But there was something in the rawness of it that Dakota recognized as the beginning of something, not the end. He did not touch her. He simply sat beside her on the log and let her cry, and watched the snow fall gently on the camp, and waited for the storm inside her to break. It took a long time. He did not mind. A chief's greatest tool, his own father had told him once, is patience. Not the patience of inaction, but the patience of complete and utter presence. The patience that says, "I am here. I am not leaving. What you are going through is real and I will not look away from it." When the crying finally slowed, Clara wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked at him sideways. She did not say anything. But she nodded once, small and deliberate. It was enough. Spring came to the Dakota Territory the way it always did, not gently but in a sudden violent burst, as though the land had held its breath all winter and finally could not hold it anymore. The snow pulled back from the hills in great retreating sheets. The creek that ran east of the camp, locked silent for months, broke open with a sound like distant thunder and ran cold and fast through the valley. Birds came back before anyone expected them. Children who had spent the winter confined to the spaces between lodges exploded outward into the wide world with a joy that was almost painful to watch. Clara watched it from the doorway of Winona's lodge and felt something she could not quite identify. It was not happiness, not yet. But it was adjacent to happiness. It was the possibility of it, hovering just at the edge of her vision like a shape in the early morning fog that might be real or might dissolve. She had changed over the winter months in ways she was still cataloging. She had learned words. Hundreds of them. She and Winona had developed their own system, pointing, miming, drawing pictures in the dirt, repeating sounds until they were recognizable. Clara's ear had sharpened with necessity, picking apart the music of the language with an attention she had never applied to anything in her previous life. She was not fluent. She was not even close. But she could make herself understood and she could understand what was said to her, and in a world where communication is life or death, that was not a small thing. She had also learned to work. Not the performative work of a woman trying to earn her keep through anxious busyness, but the deep, rhythmic, purposeful work of someone who has found their place in a system that matters. She tanned hides alongside Winona with a patience and physicality that surprised even herself. She learned to dry meat, to gather and identify plants, to read the weather from the clouds and the wind with an accuracy that made the children laugh when she was wrong and cheer when she was right. She was wrong less often as the months passed. And through all of it, in the background, present but never pressing, was Dakota. He did not make her a charity case. He did not treat her as a curiosity or a burden. What he did, quietly, consistently, over weeks and months, was include her. When there were decisions to be made that affected the whole camp, she watched the discussions even when she could not follow them entirely. When there were celebrations, she was present. When there were losses, and there were more losses, the winter had not finished its work quickly, she was allowed to grieve alongside everyone else, not set apart, not managed, but simply part of the communal body of people living through hard things together. It was this, more than anything, that put her back together. She had come from a world where she had been alone in a specific, modern way, surrounded by people and utterly invisible to them. Harlan Brecht had looked straight at her and seen a cook and $47 in a hem. The town she had passed through on her journey west had looked at her and seen a woman traveling alone, which meant they saw either a problem or a target. She had never, in her entire previous life, been seen the way Dakota had seen her on that gray afternoon at the tree line, not for what she might be used for or what she represented, but for what she actually was. One morning in late spring, Dakota found her at the creek. She was kneeling at the water's edge, filling a container, watching the current pull past her hands with an expression of quiet attention. He stood behind her for a moment before she heard him and turned. She was not startled. She had grown calm in that way over the winter, less reactive, more settled in herself, as though her edges had been smoothed by something. He sat beside her on the bank. She settled back on her heels. The water ran between them, indifferent and bright. In the language she had been learning, slowly and imperfectly and with great effort, Clara said, "I should have died in the snow." Dakota looked at the water. But I didn't, she added. He nodded once. Because of you. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she understood word by word, because she had been learning his language with the same desperate attention she had once applied to surviving the cold. He said, "A person who lives is a person who still has something to do. I only waited to find out what." She turned that over in her mind. She held it up to the light of the spring morning and examined it from every side. Later that year, when a Lakota woman from a neighboring camp fell desperately ill and needed someone to sit with her through the worst of it, Clara was the one they sent. She sat for 3 days and 3 nights without leaving. The woman lived. Clara came back to camp thin and exhausted and satisfied in a way she had never felt from anything her previous life had offered. She never did go back east. Not because she was prevented, not because she was afraid of the journey, but because east had stopped being the direction of home. Home was here, imperfect and hard and strange and hers in the only way that mattered. Chosen. Built from the ground up by 2 people who had, against every reasonable expectation, decided to trust each other in the middle of a killing winter. She had begged a Lakota chief to end her life. He had looked at her with clear eyes and refused, not with cruelty or dismissal, but with something far more powerful than either. He had refused with belief that she was not yet finished, that her story had more in it, that the most important chapter had not been written yet. He was right. It hadn't. And so she wrote it.